Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 303, Analysis of Everyday Behavior. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about actually applying punishment and using it as a form of treatment or intervention. And we're going to get into some different types of negative punishment that we can use. So I'm going to start off in talking about punishment as a form of treatment by focusing on some of the issues with punishment. Now, I've talked in the past about how reinforcement and extinction are basically the ideal ways to modify behavior, and we should use extinction along with reinforcement of an alternative behavior if we want to try and get rid of some undesirable behaviors. But some people do use punishment to reach that goal. And there are some reasons why we might not want to jump right into punishment. So first of all, punishment is also aggressive. Sometimes it can elicit pain. We'll talk about some of those situations that we might use. So using more aggressive forms of interventions to get rid of behavior can elicit aggression and can lead to more aggressive behaviors in the future. So that's number one. Number two, some people can try and get around punishment, and they can often lead to even more undesirable behaviors. So for example, a person who is trying to stop stealing cookies from a cookie jar, if we're trying to reduce that behavior, they might actually perform the behavior, and then when asked about it, they might lie about it. Lying is an additional behavior that is undesirable. So the undesirable behaviors just kind of compound on top of each other, and the multitude of these undesirable behaviors could actually end up leading to a harsher punishment than would have occurred with only the single behavior. So these things tend to kind of compound on each other. Another is that punishment can actually be negatively reinforced in the person delivering the punishment. So a great example of this is a parent trying to get their child to stop yelling and stop throwing tantrums. They use punishment to stop that behavior, but them actually performing the punishing behaviors, say it be delivering a spanking, that behavior is then reinforced because they end up with a positive outcome as a result of using that behavior. So that behavior tends to increase in the person delivering the punishment. So parents become more likely to use spankings because it leads to this positive outcome. And using these punishments, again, is not always good for the person who's receiving the punishment, and that behavior can increase in frequency because it's actually being reinforced. So that's not great. Lastly, similar to kind of the aggressive behavior point, when people use punishers, especially use punishers or forms of punishment on children, those children tend to model that same behavior. Children, the way they learn how to behave, how to act in certain situations, they imitate what other people are doing, especially people who they look up to, like their parents or teachers. So children are going to be more likely to behave in those similar ways because their parents are using them, and subsequently they're going to be more aggressive towards others, maybe hit them, maybe try to spank them, because the people who they look up to are also using those behaviors. And as we'll talk about in a future video, there are a lot of other ethical concerns associated with punishment. The end-all be-all is that you must be justified as a person enacting this intervention, using this form of punishment. You must be justified in using this technique. Oftentimes that means this is kind of the end of the road, last straw. This behavior absolutely needs to be changed. This is the only way we can think of to do it. So in that similar vein, yes, punishment is effective, just as reinforcement is in changing behaviors, but it should be used as a last resort because of all those problems and some of the ethical concerns we'll talk about in the future with punishment. If some of these functional interventions, such as DRA, such as reinforcement or extinction by themselves, are not effective, then we can shift to punishment. Ideally, shift to punishment, again, to be used in tandem with reinforcement. So instead of reinforcement and extinction, it would be reinforcement and punishment. But again, ideally, you want to try and use reinforcement, if you can, to modify behaviors, and only use punishment by itself as a last resort. So what are some of the techniques, if we do have to resort to punishment, that we use? Well, if we can, we want to stick with negative punishment. And some of the prime examples of negative punishment are timeouts, and response cost. So timeout is a form of negative punishment when the target is removed from some kind of enjoyable activity or situation after the target behavior or undesirable behavior occurs. So they lose access to some kind of positive reinforcer for a brief time, and that should ideally decrease future frequency or instances of that target behavior from occurring. So if a child is asked to perform a certain behavior and they don't, then the child is removed from the situation and placed in timeout. If a child acts out, if a child is having way too much fun playing with blocks, but they're throwing the blocks all over the place, then the child will be removed from the blocks, put into a different situation until they stop throwing a tantrum or throwing objects across the room. There are different types of timeout that we can use. There's a non-exclusionary timeout. This is where the individual, or we can use children for example, the child stays in the same room as all the other children, but they aren't able to participate in the fun activity that they were a moment ago. So if, for example, the block example, everyone else is allowed to play with blocks except for that child who is throwing them all over the place. So again, as long as the child is not being disruptive to the other children, non-exclusionary timeout can work. However, oftentimes this is just not possible. So the child must be removed from the situation entirely. This is known as exclusionary timeout. Oftentimes they're put into a room by themselves. Some schools I've heard of have timeout rooms devoted to this exact intervention. But they're removed entirely from the situation or the room that has that positive reinforcer. So a child maybe is not participating in the fun sing-along activities, they're yelling random words instead. You can't use non-exclusionary timeout because they'd still be able to enjoy in the songs. They're instead moved to an entirely different room. Some important things to remember when using timeout is that time in should be positively reinforcing, that they should be benefiting from being in the situation itself. In the singing example, the child is really enjoying and having a fun time in that room with the song. So when they're removed from that situation, they really do feel it. They're kind of hit hard, and they kind of understand that they're being put into a situation that is not as good as what they were in the first place. Additionally, it doesn't work if removing people from that situation is actually what they want in the first place. So again, you can think of situations at schools where a child acts out to try and get out of performing that activity. Well, using timeout is just going to play into their hands. It's going to positively reinforce that behavior. So you don't want to use timeout in those situations. You would use a different technique. A couple other considerations is that timeout should be practical. Again, only use it in situations where it's going to work, or where you can kind of remove the child into a situation where you're still watching them. You don't want to just tell the child to go outside, especially in a school setting, and not have an eye on them. They need to, again, be in a safe situation even when they're in timeout. Ideally, timeout is being removed from interactions at all, especially if attention is the positive reinforcer for that negative behavior. And ideally, you want to prevent the child from escaping timeout, or especially getting back into the time in situation, back into the activity. So that's one form of negative punishment. Another form of negative punishment that's commonly used is what's known as response cost. That's when we remove an amount of some kind of reinforcer after an undesirable behavior occurs. This should subsequently reduce the likelihood of that undesirable behavior occurring in the future. Importantly, we're not necessarily removing whatever is reinforcing that undesirable behavior, but we are removing some kind of stimulus or some kind of, possession that is beneficial to them in some way. So a great example of a type of reinforcer that would be removed is money. After a behavior occurs, we would punish someone, use negative punishment by fining them, by taking money away from them after that behavior. So a person parks in a parking spot they're not supposed to, we give them a parking ticket, we give them a fine. Someone doesn't pay their taxes, we give them a fine. We try and take more money away from them. So money is often what is frequently used, but we can use other things such as stickers, such as food, such as cake. There are different ways of removing some kind of reinforcer from the individual. Again, there are important things to consider when implementing response cost. You need to identify which reinforcer you want to remove. Ideally, you want to remove a reinforcer that is important to the individual, one that's going to be impactful and going to lead to behavior change in the future. You need to figure out how much of that reinforcer you want to remove. It should ideally represent the severity of the behavior that's being performed. So for a parking ticket, you wouldn't fine someone $10,000. That's ludicrous. It should be, although parking tickets arguably are still more expensive than the kind of negative behavior that's being performed. But it should be somewhat close to the severity of the behavior. You need to think about whether the reinforcer is going to be removed immediately or delayed. So people are still notified immediately after the behavior, but you don't necessarily remove that reinforcer right away. So you can think about a parking ticket. The person's not taking your money right away after you perform that behavior. You get a ticket, you're notified immediately, but then you have to pay the ticket office at some point. And you again have to keep in mind some of these ethical concerns. Is it okay to take someone's baseball away from them if they perform what you deem a negative behavior? Well, if they're an adult, probably not. If they're in a school setting and, say, for example, the baseball is property of the school, then you're probably more ethically okay to do something like that. So, again, important things to keep in mind. All right, so that's all we have on some kind of considerations of implementing punishment and some examples of negative punishment. When we come back in the next video, we'll talk a little bit about positive punishment and some of the ethical concerns. So thank you all again for your time and attention, and I will see you on the next video. Bye.